Hey everybody, welcome to Daniel Davis Deep Dive live from Washington, D.C. afternoon edition. So we are coming back again. We have a friend of the show, Matthew Ho, on with us today, and we're going to be talking about some more of the issues that are going on in the Hamas war with Israel. Now, we talked earlier today about Benjamin Netanyahu and how his tenure is going to be is a little bit uncertain right now, and the implications that could have for the war, how he wants to view Gaza after the war. But now we're going to talk about the other side of this. And I have specifically asked Matt to come on today because as we're going to see in an episode of Deep Dive next week, so be sure to tune in for that one. Matt actually has spent some time in Palestine, so he's talking from the ground. He understands a lot of this stuff. And as a result, he made many Palestinian friends, and so considers himself a friend of the people in Palestine. And he was in a Washington, D.C. protest, which we're going to show you some scenes from momentarily. But Matt is one of the great ones because he cares about people, not just Palestinian people, not just Israeli people, not just American people, not just Afghanistan, all people. He cares about everybody equally, and especially one of the reasons, but he and I both hate war is because it is indistinguished who gets hurt. And it's almost always people who don't even want war. And that's what we're going to talk about here. Too many times in the American media, the coverage that's been getting is the Palestinian people get short shrift. They don't even hardly get noticed. And the focus is partially understandable on the Israeli civilians that were slaughtered, and they deserve to be brought up because they were barbarically treated, and there's no asterisk on that one. But there is also an additional suffering and additional victims of this, which equally deserve some courage, and we're going to talk about some of that today, and that is the Gaza people. So first of all, I wanted to kind of, again, like we always do, set the stage a little bit. So Netanyahu is talking about how emphatically he is going to continue to prosecute this war. And a few days ago, he said this.
שידעו שיש דבר אחד שאנחנו לא נעשה. לא תהיה הפסקת אש בלי החזרת חטופינו. שיוציאו את זה בכלל מהלקסיקון. אנחנו אומרים את זה גם לאויבינו וגם לידידינו. ואנחנו פשוט נמשיך עד שננצח אותם. אין לנו אלטרנטיבה.
Yeah. So he said, we'll just keep carrying on no matter what. And of course, that means these bombings that you keep seeing on your television screens every day and wiping out entire sections of the Gaza City and elsewhere in the Strip. And he's not even going to entertain a ceasefire. And now then last night on ABC News, he came on to kind of give an update on what he thinks the war is going and how he's going to prosecute when he said this.
Who should govern Gaza when this is over?
Those who don't want to continue the way of Hamas, it certainly is not. I think Israel will, for an indefinite period, will have the overall security responsibility because we've seen what happens when we don't have it. When we don't have that security responsibility, what we have is the eruption of Hamas terror on a scale that we couldn't imagine.
So you have the Israeli prime minister talking about how there's no compromise. We are not going to do a ceasefire. We're just going to keep firing every day. We're going to keep fighting until we win, which means, as he's defined, the destruction of Hamas, the annihilation of them as an entity and as individuals. They'll all either die or surrender in his terms. And as with his minister of defense has said the same thing. But the other side of that battle, now we're not looking at the other side of the victims. Now that's the other side of the fighters, and that is the Hamas. Their view is this.
Dear sister, nations are not easily liberated. The Russians sacrificed 30 million people in World War II in order to liberate it from Hitler's attack. The Vietnamese sacrificed 3.5 million people until they defeated the Americans. Afghanistan sacrificed millions of martyrs to defeat the USSR and then the US. The Algerian people sacrificed 6 million martyrs over 130 years. The Palestinian people are just like any other nation. No nation is liberated without sacrifices.
Okay, so now the first point, Matt, is, I should just go ahead and point it out. I don't know where he was filming that from, but it was obviously some luxury place not in the war zone. So it's real easy for him to talk confidently about how many millions they may have to sacrifice. But the bigger picture is what we want to paint here is that you have Netanyahu on the one hand saying, we're going to keep fighting. We're not going to stop until we destroy all the Hamas. And then you got the Hamas guy say, we're going to keep going, even if the Palestinians have to pay, in the millions, because that's what it takes to win some war. In between those two, you have the Palestinian people. Now, you had some experience with this before, and I wonder what your thoughts are just right off the top when you hear those two leaders badgering each other and the people in between. Paint us a picture for what it's like for them.
Well, I think there's plenty of historical examples to pull from, but we also have to remember that both of these leaders represent theocratic movements, and they have historical impulses and a religious ideology that interweaves with that. So the idea that they are somehow continuing a millennia-long struggle is something that we can't dismiss or undercut, because that informs a lot of their popular support. And a lot of their popular support comes from the violence of the other side. I mean, so the resistance that you see from the Palestinians comes from the occupation and the oppression of Israelis. What the Israelis are doing, what motivates many of them, come from centuries-long oppression that the Jewish people have faced. As well, then too, what many will say is that the response following October 7th was a necessary one, because this is how we have to keep ourselves safe. Of course, when we go into those arguments, when you hear those arguments, question comes then is, well, how does it end? Basically you're talking about here some type of apocalyptic ending to this, some type of end of days type of thing, where the other side is fully not just subjugated, but eradicated, because in the rhetoric that we hear, that is the only solution, is the eradication of the other side. Right. Certainly Hamas no longer has it in their charter. They changed this in 2005, I believe, in their charter, but their original founding charter had the eradication of Israel. And certainly what you've heard from Israeli governments going back 70 some odd years is the eradication of Palestine, or eradication of Palestinians, some more forthrightly said than others. But you just had a member of the Knesset, one of Benjamin Netanyahu's party members, this weekend call for the erasure of the Palestinians.
Let me ask you this, because there seems to be, there's definitely a shift has taken place in global public opinion. So all during the past summer, there was tremendous amounts of violence, and hundreds of Palestinians were killed by IDF or Israeli settlers. Lots of violence in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, and it was a big issue there. Israel itself had its own issues going on politically and diplomatically. Politically within its country about judicial reform, which some suggested that Netanyahu was trying to take dictatorial powers by getting rid of one of the branches of, or making it subservient to him, et cetera. So a lot of the focus was on that. But outside of the region, really even outside of Israel, there wasn't much focus on the Palestinian. The 227, I think, was the number that were actually killed over the summer. Mm-hmm. And other than just, you might hear that number, but it didn't spark anything. Nobody paid attention. This past weekend, we saw something that was unprecedented, to my knowledge, since 1948. And one of them right here in Washington, D.C., where there was hundreds of thousands of protesters that were pro-Palestinian. They were not pro-Hamas, they're pro-Palestinian. And I wonder, Matt, and we're going to keep showing a few of these, because this was literally all over the world. This wasn't just in the United States, but this is happening everywhere. And these are all, I believe all of these are from, that we have on the screen here, are from yesterday. You participated in the one in Washington. And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about, first of all, how that protest went, what people were saying, and then generally, why do you think that it's all of a sudden people are paying a lot of attention in these numbers now?
I think you're right about the how normalized violence against the Palestinians have become. I took part every year. I take part in a remembrance for the Nakba, which is what occurred in 1948, when 750,000 Palestinians lost their homes, were kicked out of their villages, were expelled, tens of thousands were killed. Nakba in Arabic means the catastrophe, and the attendance was minimal. And then, of course, we've had here, other than North Carolina, we've had rallies and marches and vigils numbering in the thousands, in the last few weeks. And of course, this march in D.C. this past weekend. The estimates are 300,000, and I've never been a part of anything that big in my life. It was massive. The energy, I don't want to describe the energy as positive, because certainly that was not there's nothing positive about what's occurring, but the energy was dominated by a sense of solidarity. The feelings, the expressions, the messages were ones of grief, of mourning, of shock, of calls for not just peace, but reconciliation, and of course, anger. And the anger mostly directed at the American government, because on the one hand, you have Joe Biden and Tony Blinken and others saying how much the United States respects international law. They often don't say that. They say rules-based order, but also to how the United States affirms the validity of all human life, and statements like that. And then what their actions are completely, of course, contrary to, so as they're saying how they support the equal rights for Palestinians, they're sending C-17s full of bombs and missiles nearly every day to Israel. So I think the anger that you see is mostly expressed towards the White House, towards the American government. I have been to 5 or 6 of these. 2 of them were led by Jewish groups. One was led by an interfaith group, the other by Palestinian groups. I have seen nothing remotely close to being pro-Hamas rhetoric.
And that's
like anti-Israel sentiment is almost, I think most people would be surprised how little there is, how this is really.
And that's why it's an important point I wanted to ask you about, because I watched the coverage of this in the Washington, D.C. Protest, and it was characterized by many in the U.S. media as it was being a pro-Hamas protest, and that it was pro, for them, and anti-Israel. So now in that one clip, there are clearly some, because somebody had some Israeli flags on the ground and they were desecrating them. So clearly some of that part's going on. But how do you personally, how do you distinguish between I'm for the Palestinian people whom I've met and not for the Hamas terrorism, which also took place? And just generally, did you see any pro-Hamas people?
No, I haven't seen anything like that at the I think 6 things I've been to, as well as 2. Of course, this is what I do, and this is what I'm involved with, and seeing it on Twitter. And yeah, of course, you're going to find sentiments, you're going to find messages, you're going to find people saying things that are abhorrent, just as you will everywhere. But those have been the exceptions. Those have been so few in number. And of course, that is what the media will pull out. That is what the media will focus on for a number of reasons, one of them chiefly being ratings. Mainly what you see, the sentiment that is there, is one of a desire for an end to the violence. Many of these people have family. I have a friend here in North Carolina, just had breakfast with him last Friday. He's had 22 members of his family killed in Gaza.
My God.
So you're talking about the eradication, the destruction of entire families.
22 members of his family?
Members of his family, yeah. His brother's still alive, but that we have a family here in North Carolina. They're Gazan. They were here on holiday, visiting family here. He's a vascular surgeon. She's an English literature professor. And they are, of course, can't go back. But what do they go back to? Everything's been destroyed, including significant numbers of their family. So I think the connections that people have, the emotions, so the grief, the shock, the horror, and then the anger at our own government. And so you see very little, like, as I said, even very little anti-Israel. Of course, you're going to see the banner with like the swastika instead of a Star of David on the Israeli flag. But that's 1 out of 200 placards you might see, right? It's kind of like if you got into any rally, any march, any event, you can find whatever you want to find, but the reality is the sentiment, but the anger and the need for action, and and what I also witnessed here was how diverse these.
I was actually going to ask you about that. Is it just Palestinian people, or is it just regular Americans too?
It's people from all aspects of American society are there. And I think that's what's really concerning the White House and the Democrats, is because you're seeing Filipinos for Palestine, you're seeing union workers for Palestine, you're seeing Black students for Palestine. So like the diversity in the expression of solidarity is really quite dramatic. And that is, I think, concerning the White House. The White House, of course, the Democratic Party, of course, I think their whole hope is that 12 months from now, people will have forgotten. And what they're saying, of course, is that we're not going to forget. And the hashtag going around now is in November, we will remember. And that may be the reason why the White House ultimately tells Israel to back off. It's not going to be because this organized murder of 10,000 people. It's not going to be because ultimately this is a counterproductive policy. It's not because the U.S. is being sucked into the possibility or the risk of a regional war for which the United States military is completely unprepared or overextended for. It will be because there's a political consequence to this in 2024. So, I mean, that might be the reason why ultimately the U.S. tells Israel, because the United States does have that leverage. I mean, the Israelis themselves have said this. Their defense minister, Yoav Gallant, said it when he was asked, why do you allow the aid trucks into Gaza? He said, because the Americans told us to. We're entirely dependent upon them. What do you think? We can tell them no? I mean, so, and everyone who I think everyone watching this knows that, you know, Israel could not be conducting this assault on Gaza without the military support, the logistics support, the intelligence support, the political support, the media support, and the diplomatic support that the United States is providing. So I think this political pressure is exactly what's needed, and it needs to remain constant. It needs to continue to build. More people need to be brought into it. It needs to continue to be Palestinian-led and Jewish-led. We just saw yesterday Jewish groups take over, if you will. The Statue of Liberty had a major protest there.
Yeah,
and a drop there. Right. I mean, so
Gary, I'm sorry, just like Gary, if you could, while Matt's talking about this, can you pull up that clip where we were showing some of the human beings that were actually affected by this? Because these are not just numbers or Palestinians, but it's actually men who are losing their families and children who are being, you know, killed and caught up in all this stuff. So there's a very real consequence to this. And Matt, if you can continue on with what you were saying.
Yeah, and I think this video, what we're seeing here. And I think the White House breathed a sigh of relief yesterday because Donald Trump took the witness stand. And so, you know, when I was in the gym, these photos weren't on on MSNBC and Fox and CNN. It was Trump. You know, so it's similar to, I think, with what happened with Ukraine, where the White House has realized, look, Ukraine can drop from television as it did over the last 4 weeks, and Americans aren't going to care. You know, I think that's what they ultimately hope happens here in Israel, that it gets to a point where the coverage has diminished and people forget. But I just don't think it's possible. I think too many Americans have access to video, to images, to stories that don't come through the mainstream media any longer. You know, fewer and fewer Americans watch CNN, fewer and fewer Americans watch Fox and MSNBC. And so they're seeing this, and the comments they're hearing, I think particularly the old tropes that the Palestinians don't care about their people, or that whole thing of life is cheap for people who are brown. You know, I mean, all these things that no one has seen video of a Palestinian mother or father who just shrugs off their dead child. Right. I mean, like, I think so the ability of people to put themselves in their shoes, and that then goes into the larger aspects of people saying this isn't going to work, regardless of the moral aspects of this. This isn't going to work. Because if I was Palestinian, what would I do? If they bombed and killed my family, I would have a blood vengeance against them forever. In the same way, too, that many Israelis feel that way. Yeah. And then to get to your point when you showed that Hamas clip, and we talked about Netanyahu's statements. So you have factions, both Israeli and Palestinian, that view the best thing politically for them is to perceive themselves as a Sparta, right? To perceive themselves as Fortress Israel, to perceive themselves as the only hope of the beleaguered and oppressed Palestinian people, right? So you have the machination, the cynicism of using this violence. So very often, I think it's appropriate to say things like Hamas needs Israel, Israel needs Hamas, or Netanyahu needs Hamas, right? Because what is in Netanyahu's case, as you were talking about, Danny, when he goes this summer, where it was like the Israelis are getting about 1 million people sometimes out on their streets protesting Netanyahu's government. They've only got 8 or 9 million people. I mean, that's unheard of. I mean, that's massive. But what does this do? This gives Netanyahu a reason for being, right? He is the one who is protecting Israel, and he is going to fulfill the Zionist vision. And remember, go back 5-6 weeks, the UN General Assembly, Netanyahu stands in front of the entire world, literally, and with a placard with a map of the new Middle East, and there's no Palestine on it. It's all Israel. So this also plays into his visions of what things should be like.
So here's the question. That's where it's been up to this point, and so we saw what happened last weekend, and the war continues going on here with now both sides digging in deeper. Israel, so far, as we had on an earlier deep dive this morning, we were talking mainly about the military components of it, has now militarily basically surrounded and almost completely cut off Gaza City. Now then the hard part comes. So, we can see from there on that map there, that blue part, and I think has been closed by now, and they're moving, the Israeli Defense Forces moving down the coast on the left side of the map there where it's blue, and soon those are going to completely meet. Then they'll be completely surrounded. That's when the hard part starts, because now then you're talking about going in on the ground, and the casualties will continue to go up. The UN says that there's somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 civilians that never were able to get out, that are still there right now. So if they don't have food and water, and that's been cut off because Israel won't let it through because it could, help Hamas and help them continue to fight. But what about those 300,000 or 400,000 people? And then you start close quarters. And Matt, you've been in combat zones. You've been in these places. When you start gumming in there and you're firing on the Hamas people, you don't know the difference between just a man who happens to live there, and you see a man, you're going to shoot. And I can't imagine that Israel's going to be, trying to find out whether this is a Hamas fighter or if it's a civilian. They're all going to be engaged. And if these casualties start now piling up even more than just 10,000 in a month, and maybe it's, thousands in a day or so, what do you think is going to happen around the world based on what we've just seen?
Well, you're going to, the idea of Fortress Israel against the world, but with the United States backing it, which is biblical, right? In its description, right? So you have that, but you have I think there are very real long-term implications here. Of course, the most pressing is the ethnic cleansing of Gaza and the mass casualties, the organized murder that's occurring. What's going to happen, as you said, Danny, these people who are under siege? The Israelis will be in no rush. I can't imagine why they would be, to press into Gaza City. So they complete their circulation. If they did it the way we kind of did it, they're going to break the city up into grid squares and methodically move through the city.
I'm sorry, I have to interrupt because we have run out of time. I think both you and I have to go on to other shows right now. Cannot wait to get back into the next episode next week, because we have a lot more to talk about here. Thanks ever so much for your time, Matt. And we will see you guys on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.
Thanks, Danny.